The Arizona Territory would chew a soul to dust if you let it. Margaret Wilson knew that better than anyone. Her husband James was already in the ground, put there by raiders 3 years back. Now it was just her 2 little girls, and a sun-baked patch of dirt that refused to grow much of anything. She called their names, a sound swallowed by the vast, empty quiet. "Mary! Elizabeth!" They popped up from behind the chicken coop, all tangled blonde hair and dirt-stained dresses, 10 and 8 years old, and already tougher than they had any right to be. "Stay close today," Margaret warned, her voice tight. She didn't like the feel of the air. It was too still, too watchful. "Mr. Peterson at the store said there's been Apache sighted near the creek." Mary, the older one, stamped her foot. "But we were gonna pick berries." Margaret's face was a stone mask. "Not today." Tensions were high. Colonel Barrett's men had shot up a peaceful camp last month, and the whole territory was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Besides, they were low on food. A handful of potatoes and the last of the flour. Starvation was a wolf that slunk closer every single day. She had to save what little they had. That night, she tucked them into the bed they all shared. Elizabeth, the youngest, grabbed her sleeve. "Tell us about Philadelphia, Ma." So Margaret told them. She spun a tale of a magical city with wide streets and shops full of candy, of trees so tall they scraped the sky, a world away from this dusty hell. "Will we ever go?" Mary asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Someday," Margaret lied. James had dreamed of it, but James was gone. All his dreams were dust now, too. Later, with the girls asleep, she sat mending clothes by a single candle's weak light. The coyote howls were the only company she had. She whispered her husband's name into the darkness. "James, I don't know how much longer I can do this." A floorboard creaked outside. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed the shotgun James had taught her to use. The weight of it was cold and heavy in her hands. She crept to the window, peering out into the moon-drenched yard. There was nothing there, just shadows playing tricks on a tired mind. But she knew, deep in her bones, she wasn't alone. Sleep was a battlefield that night, full of shadows and James's voice calling for her from far away. She woke just before dawn to a silence that was wrong. The air in the cabin was cold and dead. She turned to the bed to wake the girls. It was empty. The blankets were thrown aside, the small impressions of their bodies already cooling. A joke, she thought. They're hiding. "Mary? Elizabeth?" Her voice cracked. The silence that answered was a physical blow. She ran outside, her thin nightdress useless against the morning chill. She searched the barn, the chicken coop, the root cellar. Nothing. Her calls grew more frantic, tearing at her own throat. Then she saw them. Footprints in the fine gray dust. 2 sets of small childish prints leading away from the house, toward Willow Creek. And alongside them, another set. Larger. Prints left by moccasins. The world stopped. The air turned to glass in her lungs. Apache. She fell to her knees, a single choked sob escaping her lips. "No. Please, God, no." But there was no time for prayer. No time to ride for help. That would take a day, and by then they'd be gone forever. She scrambled back inside, pulling on clothes, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the buttons. She grabbed the shotgun, a small sack of dried meat, and her water canteen. She had already lost a husband to this land. It would not take her daughters. She set off, following the tracks into the rising sun. Every step was a promise. Every breath was a prayer for revenge. The sun was a hammer in a cloudless sky. Margaret felt her water supply dwindle with every agonizing step. 2 days she'd been on the trail. 2 days of her insides twisting into a knot of fear and rage. The tracks would disappear on patches of rock, and she'd frantically search, her heart seizing, until she found them again in the dirt on the other side. Her water was gone. She was chewing on cactus pulp, the bitter taste a small distraction from the fire in her throat. Late on that second day, her legs finally gave out. She pitched forward, the shotgun skittering away in the dust. She lay there, the hard-packed earth cool against her cheek, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought about letting the desert take her. But then she saw their faces in her mind, Mary and Elizabeth. "I can't fail them," she croaked, forcing her trembling limbs to push her back up. As she stood, her eyes caught something, a thin ribbon of smoke rising from a canyon up ahead. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It had to be them. She moved with a new purpose, using the fading light to hide her approach. The ground was loose, treacherous. A single misplaced step could send a cascade of pebbles rattling down into the canyon, announcing her presence. As she got closer, she heard voices. But it wasn't the Apache tongue she expected. It was English, rough, greedy. "They'll fetch a good price," a gruff voice said. "Them Mexicans pay top dollar for girls with blonde hair." Margaret's blood ran cold. Slavers. Not Apache. White men. The lowest kind of predator, preying on folks like her, grabbing children to sell across the border. All the stories she'd heard, all the warnings she'd dismissed, came crashing down on her. She crawled the last few feet to the canyon rim and peered over. 4 men sat around a campfire. Rifles lay close at hand. And huddled under a filthy blanket, their small faces streaked with tears and dirt, were her daughters. A pure, white-hot rage burned away her exhaustion. It gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. 4 of them. All armed. The odds were impossible. She was just one woman, half-starved and running on fumes, with a shotgun and 2 shells. As she started to back away, to try and think, a hand shot out of the darkness and clamped hard over her mouth. An arm like a steel band wrapped around her chest, lifting her off her feet. She struggled, kicking, but it was like fighting a mountain. "Be still," a deep voice commanded in her ear, the words a low rumble. "Or they will hear you, and we will all die." The hand released her. Margaret spun around, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest, and found herself staring into the painted face of a tall Apache warrior. His eyes were dark, intense, and they watched her with a wary intelligence. "Those are my daughters," she whispered, her voice raw. The warrior nodded once, his gaze fixed on the camp below. "I know. I have tracked these men for 2 days." Hope, fragile and desperate, flickered in her chest. "You're here to rescue them?" He looked at her then, and his eyes were flat, hard things. "They killed 2 of my brothers in a hunting party. I am here to avenge my people." He paused, his words like chips of stone. "If your daughters survive, you may have them." The fragile hope died. "Please," she begged, grabbing his arm. The muscle beneath her fingers was like iron. "They're just children. They're innocent." He studied her face, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "I am Nakohai. It means warrior." He looked back at the fire. "The man with the red scarf. He is the one who took something from me. My younger brother's life." Margaret could see the flicker of pain in his eyes, quickly masked. "He was only 16 summers. I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "I lost my husband." A silent understanding passed between them. 2 people from different worlds, united by the same grief, staring down at the same evil. "There are 4 of them," Nakohe stated. "Well armed. A direct attack is suicide." Margaret's mind raced, the gears turning, oiled by rage. What if we create a diversion, split them up, draw them away from the girls? Nakohe looked at the shotgun in her hands. "You know how to use that?" "My husband taught me." A flicker of something that might have been approval crossed his face. "Good. Then we will work together, Margaret Wilson." The plan was simple, and it was deadly. Margaret would circle around to the far side of the canyon and make a noise. When they sent men to investigate, she would draw them away, while Nakohe slipped into the camp to free the girls. One mistake, and they would all be dead before the sun came up. As she moved into position, a whisper of a thought slithered into her mind. The men at the fire. They weren't just slavers. One of them had known her husband, James. "Too bad old James ain't around," the man had said. What did that mean? How did these monsters know his name? There was no time to ponder the sickening question. She found a large, loose boulder at the canyon's edge. Summoning every last ounce of her strength, she heaved it over the side. It crashed down into the darkness below, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Shouts erupted from the camp. "What was that? Go check it out!" Two of the slavers grabbed their rifles and headed right for her. This was it. Margaret waited, her heart a frantic drum, until they were close. She fired the shotgun into the air, the blast deafening in the enclosed space, and then scrambled away, darting between the rocks. "There she is! Get her!" Gunshots lit up the night. Bullets whizzed past her head, chipping stone from the rocks she used as cover. She fired her second and last shell, her hands shaking, and kept running, leading them further and further from her children. Meanwhile, Nakohe moved like a ghost. The two men left in camp were focused on the sounds of the chase. They never saw him coming. He dropped from a ledge behind the first, his knife a silent, deadly arc. The man crumpled without a sound. The second slaver turned, his eyes wide with shock, just in time to see Nakohe's tomahawk coming for him. It was over in seconds. Mary and Elizabeth were screaming under the blanket, terrified by the sudden, brutal violence. Nakohe knelt before them, his voice soft. "Your mother sent me. We must go. Now." They stared at him, at his painted face and the blood on his hands. Mary, ever the brave one, finally found her voice. "You know our ma?" "Yes. She fights for you as we speak. We must hurry." Nakohe scooped up Elizabeth, took Mary by the hand, and melted back into the shadows, heading for the place he and Margaret had agreed to meet. Margaret, though, was in trouble. Her strength was gone. She was running on sheer will, and it was failing. A bullet tore through the flesh of her arm, and she cried out, stumbling to the ground. She heard footsteps pounding toward her. She tried to lift the shotgun, to use it as a club, but her arms wouldn't obey. This is the end, she thought. Suddenly, a war cry ripped through the night. Nakohe appeared as if from nowhere, a spirit of vengeance under the moon. He launched himself at the first slaver, a whirlwind of deadly motion. The second man panicked, firing his rifle wildly into the darkness. With a surge of adrenaline, Margaret forced herself to her knees, raised the heavy shotgun, and pulled the trigger. The empty click was the loudest sound she had ever heard. The slaver turned, a grin spreading across his face as he leveled his rifle at her. But before he could fire, a knife handle sprouted from his chest. He looked down, a confused expression on his face, and then collapsed. Nakohe stood over him, his chest heaving. The canyon fell silent. "Margaret Wilson," Nakohe called, his voice strained. "It is finished." She struggled to her feet, clutching her bleeding arm. "My daughters? They are safe. They wait for you." He led her to a small cave. Mary and Elizabeth were huddled inside, shaking. They saw her and ran, crying, into her arms. "Mama, we were so scared!" Margaret held them tight, burying her face in their hair, her own tears finally falling. "I'm here now. You're safe." Over their heads, her eyes met Nakohe's. "Thank you," she breathed. He gave a single, sharp nod, then turned to leave. "Wait!" she called out. "Where will you go?" "To my people. Our paths separate here." Panic seized her. "We have nothing. The homestead. The food is gone. We won't survive the week." And a darker thought. The slavers knew James. They knew where she lived. Going back wasn't safe. Nakohe stopped. He looked at her, then at her daughters. He looked at the vast, unforgiving wilderness around them. He knew she was right. "The journey to my camp is long and hard," he said slowly. "My people are not fond of white faces." "We have nowhere else to go," she said, the desperate truth hanging in the air between them. He was silent for a long time. Then he sighed. "Then you will come with me, until you are strong enough to find your own way." As he bent to retrieve something from the body of the slaver leader, Margaret's eyes fell on the man's face, now clearly visible in the moonlight. A cold dread, separate from everything she'd just endured, washed over her. It was Mr. Peterson, the man from the general store, the man who had warned her about the Apache, the man who knew exactly how isolated and vulnerable she was. The world tilted again, revealing another layer of betrayal beneath the first. The attack wasn't random, it was planned, and the man she thought was a friendly face in a lonely world had delivered her children into the hands of monsters. Why? What did they really want? The question burned in her mind as she followed Nakohe into the mountains, away from one nightmare and straight into the heart of another. The journey was a 3-day fever dream through jagged peaks and shadowy forests. Nakohe dressed Margaret's arm with herbs that smelled of pine and earth, and the throbbing faded to a dull ache. The girls, terrified at first of their silent guide, slowly began to thaw. He was surprisingly gentle with them, carving them little animals from bits of wood and pointing out deer tracks by a stream. "Why do you have those marks?" Elizabeth asked him one night by the fire, her 8-year-old curiosity finally winning out over her fear. Nakohe touched the black lines painted on his cheeks. "They tell my story," he said, his voice softer than Margaret had ever heard it. "This one shows I belong to the Black Mountain Band. This one, that I have proven myself in battle." Margaret listened, watching the firelight play across his strong features. Everything she had ever been told about the Apache was a lie. She'd been taught they were mindless savages. But this man was thoughtful, intelligent, and bound by a code of honor that shamed the men who had taken her daughters. The contradictions churned inside her. As they walked, the question of Mr. Peterson echoed in her mind. Why would a simple store owner be involved with slavers? It didn't make sense. And his words to the other man, "Too bad old James ain't around." The implication was a poison she couldn't get out of her system. On the 3rd day they crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden valley. A small village of wickiups, skin and branch dwellings, clustered around a stream. Smoke curled into the air from a dozen small fires. It was the Apache camp. As they descended, a knot of pure dread formed in Margaret's stomach. Every person in the camp stopped what they were doing to stare. The silence was heavy, hostile. Warriors with rifles watched their approach, their faces like stone. An old man with a face like a weathered map emerged from the largest wickiup. His eyes, dark and sharp, took in Margaret and her children. This was the chief. Nakohe spoke to him in the Apache tongue, his voice low and urgent. He gestured toward Margaret, then held up something he had taken from the slavers' camp. It was a worn leather pouch. The chief, Niche, took the pouch and opened it. He pulled out a small, intricately beaded necklace. A flicker of recognition, then deep sorrow, crossed his face. When Nakohe finished speaking, Niche turned his piercing gaze on Margaret. His English was clear, precise. "My warrior tells me you fought like a she-bear for your cubs." He held up the necklace. "He also tells me you recovered this. It belonged to his younger brother, the one these men murdered." Margaret looked at Nakohe, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had made her a hero. "Your warrior saved my daughters," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I owe him everything." "A debt has been created," Niche said. "Among our people, debts are honored. You and your children will stay. You will work. And you," he said, turning to Nakohe, "are responsible for them. Teach them our ways." An older woman named Istas, who Margaret learned was Nakohe's aunt, led them to a small wickiup. She gave them food and blankets, her kindness a balm on Margaret's raw nerves. "My nephew sees honor in you," Istas said simply. "That is enough for me." Life in the camp was hard, but it was honest. Margaret worked alongside the women, her hands growing calloused, her body strong. The girls, with the incredible resilience of children, made friends and were soon chattering away in a mix of English and Apache. Nakohe was often gone, hunting or scouting. But when he was in camp, he would spend the evenings with them, teaching Margaret how to track, how to read the clouds. He told her stories of his people, of their gods, and their history. She found herself waiting for these moments, drawn to the quiet strength she saw in his eyes. One evening, she finally worked up the courage to ask him. "The man from the store, Mr. Peterson, he was one of them. He knew my husband. What does it mean?" Nakohe grew very still. "The slavers were not just passing through your valley, Margaret. They are part of a larger network. They steal children, yes, but they also steal cattle and supplies. They sell them to prospectors, to other settlements. and sometimes to soldiers at the forts. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Colonel Barrett's men? Nakohe nodded. Barrett turns a blind eye. In return, the slavers give him information. The location of our camps, our hunting parties. He looked directly at her. The attack that killed my brothers was no accident. The slavers led the soldiers right to them. The ugly puzzle was starting to come together, but the piece with James's name on it was still missing. As weeks turned into a month, Margaret felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. This life was brutal, but it was real. There were no lies here. She watched Nakohe with her daughters and saw a tenderness that made her heart ache. Istas saw it too. "My nephew watches you," she said one afternoon as they ground corn. "He has never looked at a woman that way. It causes talk. Some of the warriors do not like it." Margaret's heart hammered. "There is nothing between us." "Not yet," Istas said, her eyes knowing. That night, Margaret's thoughts were a whirlwind. What future was there for her here? A white woman among the Apache? A widow falling for a warrior whose people were at war with her own? Nakohe found her sitting alone, staring at the stars. "Your thoughts are far away," he said, sitting beside her. "I don't belong here," she whispered. "Where do you belong, Margaret Wilson?" he asked, his voice gentle. "At that empty homestead? Waiting for the rest of Barrett's friends to come for you?" She had no answer. The life she had left behind felt like a dream. "My path was supposed to be simple," he said, looking up at the sky. "To fight for my people until I died. But the path has turned. It has led me to you." His dark eyes held hers. The space between them crackled with unspoken words, with a feeling so powerful it stole the air from her lungs. Before either of them could speak, a shout cut through the camp. A warrior, wounded and stumbling, had just returned. Nakohe was on his feet in an instant. He ran to the center of the camp, Margaret right behind him. The news was a death sentence. Soldiers. A large patrol, moving fast. They were sweeping the mountains, and they were heading straight for the valley. It was Colonel Barrett's company. The camp exploded into organized chaos. People were packing, preparing to flee. Nish, the chief, found Margaret in the turmoil. His face was grim. "The soldiers will find you here," he said, his voice heavy. "They will see a white woman and her children among us. You have a choice to make, Margaret Wilson. Will you tell them you are a prisoner, and buy your own safety with our lives? Or do you stand with us?" The world narrowed to that single impossible question. Betray the people who had saved her, or declare war on the world she had come from. Her past, or her future. She looked from the chief's searching eyes to Nakohe, who was already strapping on his weapons, his face set for a battle he did not expect to survive. Her choice was no choice at all. Dawn was a bloody smear across the eastern peaks. Margaret hadn't slept. After hiding Mary and Elizabeth with Istas, she'd found Nakohe. "I'm fighting with you," she'd said. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "They are your people." "No," she said, the word coming from a place of certainty deep within her. "My people are the ones who showed me kindness. My people are here." The tension in his shoulders seemed to melt away. "Then we fight together." Chief Nish accepted her help, his eyes showing a grudging respect, and Margaret had a desperate idea. "Your husband," she said, remembering stories James had told her. "He talked of military tactics. He said the army always expects you to run for high ground." Nish and the warriors listened as she sketched a map in the dirt. "They'll have scouts watching the mountain passes. But here," she pointed, "there is a canyon, narrow with steep walls. James called it the Serpent's Tooth. The soldiers will avoid it, thinking it's a perfect place for an ambush." "It is a perfect place for an ambush," one of the warriors growled. "Exactly," Margaret said. "Which is why you will send the women, children, and elders through it. While you," she looked at Nakohe, "create a diversion. Lead the main force of soldiers away, toward the mountains. They will follow the bait." The plan was daring. It was suicidal for the warriors who would act as the diversion. But it was their only chance. As the camp prepared to split up, Nakohe knelt before her daughters. "Be brave," he told them. Elizabeth threw her little arms around his neck. "Promise you'll come back." He looked at Margaret over the child's head, his face a mask of pain. "I promise to try." Then he stood before her. Words were useless now. He reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Until we meet again, Margaret Wilson." She pressed her hand over his. "I'll be waiting." Then he was gone, melting into the trees with the other warriors, and she was leading a terrified line of families into the dark maw of the serpent's tooth. 2 hours later, the distant crackle of rifle fire echoed from the mountains behind them. The diversion had begun. Margaret's heart clenched for Nakohe. "He is strong," Istas said, walking beside her. "And now, he has a reason to live." The canyon was a claustrophobic trap. If the soldiers found them, they'd be slaughtered. By midday, Nish called a halt. Margaret, needing to do something, scrambled up a rockfall to get a better view. What she saw turned her blood to ice. Far below, a second column of soldiers was not following the diversion. They were cutting across the valley, heading directly for the entrance of the Serpent's Tooth. They had been betrayed. Or Barrett was smarter than she thought. She scrambled back down, her voice breathless. "They've found us! Cavalry moving fast. They'll be here in an hour." Panic rippled through the group. "We cannot outrun horses." But Margaret's mind was racing. "There's another way," she told Nish, remembering another of James's stories. "A side canyon. The entrance is hidden behind a waterfall. He said it was a dead end, but that it went deep into the rock." "And if they follow us in?" Nish demanded. "Then we make our stand there," she said, her voice hard. "The passage is too narrow for more than one man to pass at a time. We can hold them off." Nish stared at her, then gave a sharp nod. "Lead the way." It was a death march. They ran, carrying the children, the elders gasping for breath. They could hear the sounds of the cavalry now, the jingle of harnesses, the shouts of men. They reached the waterfall just as the first soldiers appeared at the far end of the canyon. The entrance was a dark slit in the rock, hidden behind the curtain of water. One by one, they slipped through, soaking wet and terrified. Margaret was the last one in. She pressed herself against the cold, damp rock, holding her breath. A scout rode right past, his horse shying away from the water. He paused, looking directly at the waterfall for a heart-stopping second. Margaret's hand went to the knife at her belt. Then another soldier called out to him, and the scout kicked his horse, moving on. They were safe. For now. They huddled in the darkness of the hidden cave as the main body of soldiers rode by. That night, the cold was a living thing. Margaret couldn't sleep, her mind a torment of fear for Nakohe. "He will come," Istas whispered beside her in the dark. "He has a promise to keep." Just then, a soft whistle echoed from the cave entrance. It was a signal. A warrior on watch answered. Shadowy figures slipped through the waterfall. Margaret's heart pounded. A familiar voice cut through the darkness. "Margaret!" It was Nakohe. He was alive. He was torn and bleeding, leaning heavily on another warrior, but he was alive. She ran to him, and this time, she didn't stop herself. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "You came back." "I promised," he whispered, his arms wrapping around her. Only 5 warriors had made it back. They had bought the time needed, but the cost had been terrible. "Barrett's men have made a camp at both ends of the Serpent's Tooth," Nakohe reported to Nish. "They believe they have us trapped." He took a ragged breath. "But they were not just hunting us. I captured one of their scouts. I made him talk before he died." He looked at Margaret, and his eyes were filled with a terrible understanding. "They are looking for you, Margaret. The scout said the slavers told Colonel Barrett that you had it, that you knew where James hid it." Margaret stared at him, confused. "Hid what? We had nothing." "A book," Nakohe said, his voice grim. "A ledger. The scout said your husband, James, was working for them. He was their bookkeeper. He handled the money, kept track of the sales of children, The illegal sales of guns and whiskey to the prospectors, and the payments he made. To Colonel Barrett. The world dissolved into a sickening roar in Margaret's ears. James. Her quiet, gentle James. A monster. It couldn't be true. But she knew, with a certainty that was like a physical sickness, that it was. The slavers hadn't been looking for her daughters. Not really. They had taken them as leverage, to force her to give them the one thing that could destroy them all. Her husband hadn't just been murdered by raiders. He had been silenced by his partners, and he had left behind a time bomb, right under the floorboards of her own home. And Colonel Barrett knew she was sitting on it. This wasn't a battle for survival anymore. It was a race. Barrett wanted that ledger to bury his crimes. But for Margaret, it was the only thing that could prove what had been done to her. To Nakohe's people. To all the stolen children. It was the only thing that could deliver justice. "I have to go back," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "We go back," Nakohe corrected her. "Together." The plan was insane. A handful of warriors and one determined woman against an entire company of U.S. cavalry. They would use the hidden cave system, which Nakohe knew from his youth, to travel back through the mountains, bypassing Barrett's patrols. They would emerge near the homestead under the cover of darkness. The journey back was a tense, silent ordeal. Margaret was no longer just a mother. She was a woman walking into the heart of a conspiracy that had been built on the bones of her own life. Everything she thought she knew about her husband, her home, her safety, had been a lie. 2 nights later, they lay on a ridge overlooking her small ranch. It was crawling with soldiers. Tents were pitched in her yard. A command post had been set up in her tiny cabin. They were tearing the place apart, searching for the ledger. "They will not find it," she said to Nakohe, her voice cold. "James was clever. He built a hidden compartment under the hearthstone. He told me it was for valuables in case of a raid." The irony was a bitter pill. They waited for the deepest point of the night, when the moon was hidden and the guards were drowsy. Nakohe and 2 other warriors moved like smoke, dispatching the sentries with silent efficiency. Margaret's heart was a cold, steady stone in her chest. Fear had been burned out of her, replaced by a diamond-hard resolve. She slipped into her own home. It was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, belongings scattered. 2 officers were asleep at her kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey between them. She crept past them, the floorboards groaning under her feet. She knelt at the hearth. The stone was heavy, but adrenaline gave her strength. She lifted it. There, in the dark space beneath, was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. The ledger. As her fingers closed around it, a floorboard behind her creaked. "Well, well, look what we have here," a voice drawled. She turned slowly. It was Colonel Barrett himself. He stood in the doorway, a pistol in his hand, a cruel smile on his face. "I had a feeling you'd come back for it. Your husband was a fool to think he could cross me. Now, be a good girl and hand it over." Nakohe appeared in the window behind Barrett like a phantom. But before he could act, Barrett seemed to sense him, spinning around and firing his pistol into the darkness. A cry of pain echoed from outside. "Nakohe!" Margaret screamed. Barrett laughed. "It seems your savage friend is out of commission. Now, the book." Margaret looked at the ledger in her hands, then at the face of the man who had destroyed her life. She made a choice. She didn't hand it to him. She threw it into the fire. The oilskin wrapper caught instantly, flames licking up the edges of the pages. Barrett's face contorted with fury. He lunged for the fire, trying to pull the book out, screaming as the flames seared his hands. In that moment of distraction, Margaret grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with all her might. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The 2 sleeping officers were awake now, scrambling for their guns. But the doorway filled with Apache warriors. It was over in seconds. Margaret ignored them, rushing outside. Nakohe was on the ground, clutching his shoulder, blood soaking his shirt. But he was alive. "The book!" he gasped. "It's gone." "No," she said, pulling a single charred page from her dress pocket. She had ripped it out before throwing the rest into the fire. On it, in James's neat handwriting, was a list of dates and payments, with Colonel Barrett's name signed at the bottom. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. They didn't run. They held the homestead, using the captured, terrified officers as hostages. Nakohe sent his fastest warrior, not with a story, but with the charred page and one of the captured officers, to Fort Grant, a different outpost commanded by a general known to be Barrett's bitter rival. For a full day, they were under siege. Soldiers surrounded the small cabin, but without their commander, and with 2 of their own inside. They were hesitant to attack. Margaret, Nakohe, and the few remaining warriors fought them off, a desperate, hopeless last stand. Then, on the afternoon of the second day, a new column of soldiers appeared on the horizon, riding hard. But they weren't flying Barrett's colors. The soldiers surrounding the cabin lowered their weapons, confused. The new troops, led by General Crook himself, rode into the yard and disarmed them. Barrett was dragged out of the cabin, groaning, and placed under arrest. Justice had come to the Arizona Territory. The aftermath was a blur. The story of Colonel Barrett's corruption, of the slaver ring operating under his protection, became a scandal that rocked the territory. Margaret's testimony, backed by the charred page and the confession of the captured officer, sealed his fate. But there was no going back. Her home was a battlefield. Her husband's memory was a lie. Her old life was a ghost. Nish and his people offered her a new one. Months later, as the desert bloomed after the winter rains, a ceremony was held. Margaret, dressed in soft doeskin, stood beside Nakohe. Mary and Elizabeth, now chattering in fluent Apache, played with their new friends. "The spirits have woven your path into ours," Chief Nish said, blessing their union. That night, she sat with her husband, watching the stars blaze in the infinite desert sky. Her daughters were asleep, safe. "When I followed their tracks from the homestead," she said softly, "I thought my life was over. I never dreamed it was just beginning." Nakohe took her hand. "Our people say every fire makes the ground richer for new growth. What was destroyed has made way for something stronger." She looked at the man beside her, at the family she had found in the heart of the wilderness. The path here had been paved with blood, tears, and betrayal. But it had led her home. The most worthwhile paths rarely are easy. She rested her head on her warrior's shoulder, at peace for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. If this story of a mother's unbelievable strength and the discovery of a truth darker than the deepest canyon kept you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the incredible tales we have coming next.